G'day mate, Luke Ford here. I want to talk more about this superb book, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised. The book is by Professor Mark B. Shapiro, and we're on chapter 4. So he's talking about now the fourth essential principle
Hey mate,
of
Luke
the
Ford here. I want to talk more
Jewish
about this
faith.
superb book.
The Limits of Orthodox. Okay, so what are the 13 essential principles of the Jewish faith according to Maimonides? So once again, Judaism was about 3,000 years old before it formulated a creed. And the one that's most famous in the Jewish tradition is the one that was formulated by Rabbi Moshe ben Maimonides, also known as the Rambam. So the 13 principles of the Jewish faith, according to Maimonides, is 1, belief in the existence of the Creator, belief in God. 2, belief in God's unity. 3, belief in God's non-corporeality, that he does not take human form. 4th, belief in God's eternity. 5th, the imperative to worship God exclusively and no foreign gods. 6, the belief that God communicates with man through prophecy. 7, belief in the primacy of the prophecy of Moses, our teacher. 8, the belief in the divine origin of the Torah. 9, the belief in the immutability of the Torah. 10, the belief in God's omniscience and providence. And 11, the belief in divine reward and retribution. And 12, the belief in the arrival of the Messiah in the Messianic era. And 13, the belief in the resurrection of the dead. I'll play a little bit of Mark Shapiro here. He's speaking with an old friend of mine, Stephen Weiss. So this is video from 4 years ago.
Has it meant to be Orthodox? And finding that a lot of Orthodoxy today is built on very much a myth of the past.
Societies generally create myths. I mean, American society has myths, Israeli society has myths, and Orthodox society, of course, has myths. And what's very interesting about Orthodox society is that the myths often change, because what I tried to show in this book is what was acceptable, in quotes, maybe 200 years ago is today no longer acceptable. And since we're dealing with a tradition that basic to being a traditional Jew is, like the word tradition, you follow tradition, that creates problems when the way you're living is not in line with the way people lived hundreds of years ago, because the ultimate validation of a traditional society is that you're following the tradition. And therefore, the approach adopted by many, as I described, is, we're talking about the elites, because they're the ones who control the outlay of information, is to recreate the tradition, to recreate a mythical past to serve the needs of the present.
What you've done is you've gone through, to a degree, going back to at least medieval times, perhaps some semi-ancient stuff, where you found examples of not only of censorship, but of justification for censorship, and then seen that layer upon itself through the modern era. Is there one discovery here that you were just very surprised by recently? I can't believe someone actually tried to pull this off, or did pull it off.
There is a medieval authority who explains that Leah, describing why
the
she was hated.
matriarchs.
Yeah, the matriarch, there was Leah and there was Rachel, and Leah was not beloved as much as Rachel, that he states that Jacob, the patriarch, used to beat Leah. And that's why she was so upset. Now, this was so shocking that even a 19th century publisher recognized the problem and refused to insert it, refused to include it there, deleted it. And it was only about 15 years ago, when it was published for manuscript, that we actually see what was written. And I then explored the matter of, that's the idea again today, the idea that you could beat your wife. I mean, everyone would assume, of course, Judaism thinks that that's forbidden, it's crazy, it's evil, all these things. And yet, if you look at the sources, you see that's not the case, that there were great rabbis who thought otherwise.
Part of what you're revealing here is not just that texts were changed, but how they were changed and how we can recover some of their original statements.
I work at a Catholic university, and I have scholars there. There are scholars there of Catholicism. I know scholars in Islam. I have asked my colleagues, now it could be they don't know but everything about this matter, but I've asked my colleagues, are there, in the major ask trends of Christianity and Islam, do you have the phenomenon that I document in this book? That is, of rewriting of text, of trying to cover up the history of the past. There's no question that both Islam and Christianity did that in pre-modern times, but none of them have been able to point me to examples where today you find that going on. And you find it all the time in Orthodoxy, in certain segments of Orthodoxy. So that itself is significant. There are elites who have the information, and they determine what information should be filtered to the masses. And sometimes it's in official fashion, like a newspaper, we mentioned Yated Na'aman or others. Other times it's in an unofficial fashion, an individual publisher who makes this decision on his own. We have other examples. But there's no question that you have this paradigm of elites who have access to the information, making decisions, paternalistic decisions on behalf of the masses, what they should and shouldn't know.
And now, giving names and stories to women of the Bible, Michal Lemberger. There's a long tradition of
we don't need to give
midrash,
names and stories
taking
to
the
women of the Bible. So let's skip away from that. Get back to Chapter 4, Limits of Orthodox Theology by Mark Shapiro. So, fourth principle, affirms God's priority to other beings. In other words, that not his eternity, as has often been assumed. And creation ex nihilo, creation after absolute non-existence. There are no Jewish scholars who question God's priority, however it may be defined. However, this is not the case with regard to the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, which has never achieved unanimous acceptance. Thus, in describing creation, Ibn Ezra writes, most biblical commentators explain that the word bara indicates creation ex nihilo. He rejects this and concludes the meaning of bara, the Hebrew word, is to cut or to set a boundary. The intelligent person will understand what I am alluding to. So, Ibn Ezra, a Jewish commentator living around the 12th century, he was always a little bit edgy. So, for example, you can just look up Ibn Ezra's secret. So he said in one famous commentary, I have a secret, and he who is wise will keep silent. I have a secret. So yeah, you put Ibn Ezra in to Google, one of the first things that is suggested to you is Ibn Ezra's secret. So what is Ibn Ezra's secret? And so it's a little bit edgy. So commenting on the introductory verses of Deuteronomy, Abraham Ibn Ezra lived 1089 to 1164, wrote, if you understand the secret of the 12 as well as, and Moses wrote, Deuteronomy 31:9, and the Canaanites were then in the land, on the mountain God will appear, here is his iron bed, you will recognize the truth. The secret of the 12 in his oblique reference to Ibn Ezra's opinion that the last 12 verses of the Torah were not written by Moses, but by Joshua, because they speak about Moses' death in the morning of the Israelites. What Ibn Ezra means here is that the last 12 verses of the Torah are only an example of a broader phenomenon of late editorial comments in the Torah. In other words, Ibn Ezra held that the Torah was not a unitary work, but was instead a composite work written at different points of time, as opposed to being a unitary work that God just gave to Moses at Mount Sinai. The author writes, I knew this Ibn Ezra since high school, but I never really digested the point until I went for my master's in biblical history at Hebrew University. In one of the classes I took with Professor Mordechai Kogan, he was discussing the phenomenon of editorial comments in the Bible, specifically ones that imply a late date of composition. The parade example came from Deuteronomy chapters 1 to 4. I read through this section of the Torah with fresh eyes, and the phenomenon hit me like a ton of bricks. I remember having gone to my friend's house for Shabbat dinner and speaking for hours about this with my old Chavrusa, study partner, and his wife. I may have inadvertently ruined their Shabbat dinner. And so the opening speech in Deuteronomy is framed by editorial comments about where Israel was during the wilderness experience of where Moses delivered the speech. The reason Ibn Ezra lists this as late editorials, not only because of the third person narrator's voice in a speech that is all first person, but also because of the term used to refer to where the Israelites were standing. The Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan. If the Israelites were on the other side of the Jordan, Where is the author of the verses standing when it was written? And then about Og's bed. What bothers Ibn Ezra here are three things. First, Moses literally just killed Og weeks before. Why would Moses need to use his bed for proof when the people could have seen him or his body with their own eyes? Furthermore, why would Og's bed be in Rabbah of the Ammonites, not in his own palace in the Bashan? Finally, if for some reason the bed was in Rabbah, how could Moses or the Israelites see it? So Ibn Ezra, pretty edgy. He was often attacking Rashi, and he's not accorded the same precedence in Jewish study of Torah that a commentator like Rashi is. Ibn Ezra was much more rational than Rashi. He was often going up against Rashi. So Ibn Ezra, one edgy dude. Okay, back to Mark Shapiro. The implication of this and other comments by Ibn Ezra is that he believed the world was created by giving form to eternal matter. In other words, that there was form prior to the creation, so it was not exactly creation ex nihilo. In his commentary on Genesis, Ibn Ezra writes that the entire creation story refers to the sub-lunar world, implying that the spheres are eternal. This implication is even stated explicitly in his commentary on Daniel, where he states that the heavenly bodies do not begin nor do they end. Among those who interpret Ibn Ezra along these lines are Levi ben Abraham, lived in the 14th century, Rabbi Nisim ben Moses, 14th century, Rabbi Yosef ben Eliezer von Fields, 14th century, Rabbi Ezra Gatigno, 14th century, Rabbi Isaac Abarbanel, Rabbi David Arama, 16th century, and Rabbi Yosef Solomon Delmonigo, lived in the 17th century. Though there has recently been a great deal of discussion among scholars about Ibn Ezra's view, with some arguing that he advocates an emanationist doctrine, it is fairly clear that he is denying creation ex nihilo. So the overarching point in Mark Shapiro's book is that for every one of the 13 essential principles of the Jewish faith, as articulated by Maimonides, you'll find great rabbis disagreeing with them. So let me play a little bit more from Mark Shapiro so you can get a sense of the author of this terrific, thoughtful book.
It's a pleasure to be here with Rabbi Dr. Martin Shapiro, who holds the Weinberg Chair in Judaic Studies at the University of Scranton, a graduate of Brandeis for his BA and Harvard for PhD. He's the author of numerous books, all of which I've enjoyed very much, articles and reviews. He's written Between the Yeshiva World and Modern Orthodoxy and the Limits of Orthodox Theology, which many have told me really transformed their worldviews, and both of which were National Jewish Book Award finalists. His latest book, our topic today.
And speaking of transforming their worldviews, I know this one Orthodox rabbi who read this book, the Limits of Orthodox Theology, and he lost his faith over it. He became an atheist and started doing intermarriages, marriages between Jews and non-Jews. So sometimes it's entirely unpredictable what direction a book will take you.
Today is Changing the Immutable, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History. And he's currently writing a book on the thought of Rav Kook. I've got a Rav Kook picture right there. You didn't see it. And regularly publishes scholarly articles on the Sfarim blog. Thanks for taking time to talk.
Glad to be here.
So on the topic of this book, Changing the Immutable, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History, why did you write this?
Well, I'm first of all, very interested in the history of the Jewish book. Three areas in particular: forgeries, plagiarisms, and censorship. So I don't know if we're going to get to the books on the other two, but was the first one I was censoring, because I noticed an interesting phenomenon over the years, that censorship in canonical texts, I'm not referring to, let's say, censorship, which we know has a long history of non-Jews censoring Jewish texts, but of Jews censoring their own texts. And on the face of it, it's quite shocking, because why would people be censoring standard works? I'm not talking about heretical texts or anything like that. On the other hand, it makes a certain amount of sense, because there's a dissonance that's often created when there's a worldview that's advocated and assumed to be authoritative. And yet, if you look at older texts written by pious figures of the past, they present an alternate viewpoint. So that's scholars can understand that times change, there's differences, but for the masses, this creates a dissonance. And the way to, I guess, solve that problem has been to take these texts out of the public eye. But it shows you just how much of this has been going on and continues to go on.
What are some of the most profound or influential examples where there's censorship or even alteration of truth that is done, as you said, to protect the religious masses?
In the book, I have a number of different categories. I do them by chapters. Ironically, I think the most significant, if I would probably mention it today, I really didn't even discuss in the book, although I mentioned it like on the first page, but it continues to go strong. And that is the removal of women's pictures and from the public eye. This is a completely new phenomenon, which I really, if I had to do the book now, just a few years later, I would include a whole chapter on it, because this is something that is a complete reversal of what was done in the most right-wing communities. So that, I think, is quite profound, removing women, who are such an important part of the Jewish community, from the public eye. And yet I can show texts, right-wing Hasidic texts that proudly showed pictures of the great Rebbitzins of the past. And it isn't just a question of removing the pictures. It's all about removing women as having significance in the public sphere in a way that we didn't see in previous years. The other important aspect, I think, or one of the most important, relates to Zionism. We just celebrated Yom Ha'atzmaut, and today in the Haredi world, there's a very negative view towards Zionism, towards views of Rav Kook, not necessarily the person, although that you find as well. And yet, in his time, Rav Kook was respected as the Rabbi of Jerusalem by most of the traditional Jews. In fact, the Lithuanian world almost exclusively looked towards him as their rabbi. Many of the great rabbis were supporters of Zionism, at least the state declared positively about it. Today, that makes for uncomfortable reading. So there's a lot in the way of rewriting of the past in that respect. And that's had enormous impact on broad stretches of the Orthodox society, including influencing into the more modern Orthodox society. So those are two of the big ones.
These more extreme measures of modesty and censoring women, when would you date that to really gaining steam? And why do you think that's become so prevalent in Orthodox circles today?
Now, you always had extreme views like this, although I have to point out that if you go to the Eda Haredit, Satmar type newspapers from the 50s, you have pictures of women in it. It seems to be like the last 15 years, and I'm not sure whether it's started in Israel or in America. Apparently in Israel, never was an order by any great rabbis.
So I just want to go to an excerpt from my blog where I interviewed an Orthodox rabbi, David Gruber, and it was by reading this book that he became an atheist, which was not the intention of the book. So we've got David S. Gruber, from Orthodox rabbi to secular humanist. So he was a rabbi in Dallas, an Orthodox rabbi in Dallas, and reading this book really did a number on him. So he got a position in Dallas. Where was it? He was head of Judaic studies at a Jewish high school in Dallas, and he says, a year and a half into my 3-year contract, I'd always been very liberal and skeptical. I'd always asked questions that other people didn't ask, and I was troubled by stuff that maybe didn't trouble other people. I was pretty comfortable knocking those square pegs into round holes from time to time. Then something clicked. It was The Limits of Orthodox Theology by Mark Shapiro. He'd probably be devastated, but what are you going to do? And Mark Shapiro replied to my inquiry, one never knows how people will be affected by what you write, but I would think that the book would show him that you can still be Torah observant and not have to be so strongly bound to dogma. So he talked about, I got a grant, David Gruber says, I got a grant to buy $350 worth of books for the teachers. And I read this one. I can't say what it was specifically in the book, but something clicked. I was like, wait a minute. I've always been interested in how does Torah treat the other, women, non-Jews, homosexuals. You know the blog Jewish Atheist? It's fascinating. He talks about the double loop learning and single loop learning. Most of what we do in life is single loop learning. That's what we do in life, single loop learning. We get a piece of data and incorporate it into our paradigm. You mean if the Torah wasn't written by God, you have one answer for everything? You don't have to force 10,000 square pegs into 10,000 round holes. At first it was scary. Whoa, I'm an Orthodox rabbi. I just started thinking about stuff. I just started taking out books, and I started reading biblical criticism books and books about biblical archaeology and books about physics. One of the big secrets that everybody knows and doesn't want to talk about is that in the Orthodox world, we say, biblical criticism, nobody believes in that stuff anymore. Archaeology, come on, it's more of an art than a science. It's not really serious. We don't have to delve into it. We don't have to research it. We don't have to think about it. It's like my 10th grade biology teacher who was already, who said, evolution, nobody really believes in that stuff anymore. Meanwhile, back on the ranch at the university, that's what everybody believes in. It doesn't have to do with belief. They look at the facts. The more and more I read, I thought, wow, this makes a whole lot more sense. Gradually, I came to, wow, Torah is actually more beautiful when you look at it this way. See tremendous beauty in the Torah with the realization that it was written by human beings some 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. Some of the stuff they believed in was pretty shocking and abhorrent, but in terms of an intellectual tradition and a culture, it's a beautiful book. When you understand how it's put together, I think its beauty just grows. I was always troubled by Joshua marches into the land and they kill man, woman, and child. I heard all the excuses and I gave them too. Here's how you need to interpret it. But come on, that's what it said. Up until the 20th century, nobody said it meant anything else. When you read the stuff in the public view, that didn't happen. You go, wait a minute, you in the Orthodox world say there's something wrong with me for not believing that happened. You're so insistent that we're adamant that our forefathers committed genocide. No, they didn't. We are descended from the Canaanites. That story was written much later. I'm much more comfortable with that than that my ancestors marched into the land and committed the first known act of genocide. The more I read, the more I formed a new paradigm of thinking. At first, I was like, where do I go now? Reform Judaism sounds attractive. So I read a whole lot of books on Reform Judaism. One of the problems with Orthodox Judaism is that we say Reform and Conservative Jews, they don't know anything. We choose anecdotes from our life to strengthen it. The Reform or Conservative rabbi didn't graduate with full honors. And then I came across the book Letters to a Christian Nation by Sam Harris. I read it. I'm like, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about. That makes total sense. But maybe I don't need liberal Judaism. Then I read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, Victor Stanger's books. The more I read, the more atheism made sense. And so what about my wife? She was in the same school. She was teaching Chumash, meaning the Bible. And she said, my students asked me, what's the deal with women? If they make a vow, the husband can annul it. My students were not Orthodox. Said, why is that so? Why can't a woman annul her husband's vows? She expected me to help her hammer the square peg into a round hole like I usually did. I just said, that's a good question. Maybe it's because the Torah was written by a male chauvinist. She's like, what do you mean? I said, well, maybe it wasn't written by God. What? We just started having a discussion. I said, I just can't keep it to myself anymore. Let me tell you about where I am. Started having deep discussions. She'd been having the same kind of thoughts. She's not one to go read 150 books. She's Israeli, very straight and to the point. We kept having discussions. We made separate but intertwined journeys for a whole variety of reasons. She decided to not continue teaching. I had another year to go. She said, I'm not covering my head anymore. I don't think I believe in this. Then it was, I think I'm buying my first pair of pants. Gradually, she made her journey to atheism, which was parallel to mine. She could be more open about it because I was still running an Orthodox day school. I have a 14-year-old child, a 7-year-old, and a 5-year-old. And the little boys were little boys. And I said, this is what we're doing now. We're going to change things a bit. My daughter was a different story. She was going to an Orthodox day school. Said to my wife, this is our fault. We raised her. She decides to continue being Orthodox. We're going to have to accommodate that. Said to my daughter, let's have some discussions. We've been doing Gemara, Talmud until now. Let's figure this out together. Here's a book. Read it, come back and tell me what you think. Here's another book. Read it, come back and tell me what you think. We just had some discussion. She said, this makes a lot of sense. I never really thought about this. So they all journeyed to atheism together. I said to the rabbi, didn't you know all this stuff about the documentary hypothesis from your father? And David says, yes and no, that is a fascinating question. I was given the answers and the excuses. Remember that cheesy movie 48 Hours when Eddie Murphy walks into a bar and says, I'm your worst nightmare, I'm an N-word with a badge. David, I'm your worst nightmare. I'm a secular humanist with an orthodox smicha, meaning rabbinic ordination. What the Orthodox do is to set up a straw man. They describe things out of context. They quote a few people who believed in the documentary hypothesis. They quote them out of context, and they say nobody really believes that anymore. There's a really horrific article like that by Nathan Lopez Cardoso, a good example of shoddy scholarship. My mother passed away in 1993. My dad thinks she was orthoprax. That means orthodox in practice, but not necessarily in belief. She lived orthodox, but may not have believed orthodox. 2 years later, it was Baruch Goldstein who went into that mosque and shot about 40 people. My dad picked up the phone and said, "This is it. I've been a good boy for the last 13 years. I made believe I was Orthodox. Made believe I wasn't a conservative rabbi anymore. I raised you kids as Orthodox, but this is it. If this is what Orthodoxy produces, I'm getting off the train." So that's a conversation with an Orthodox rabbi who read this book and turned him into an atheist. David Gruber lives in Texas. So dangerous, dangerous book. You should not read this book. It's very, very dangerous. And here is the book on Amazon. Do not read this book, guys. Turn you into an atheist. Limits of Orthodox Theology, Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised. Don't read this book. It's very, very dangerous. It should be forbidden.
To change the policies in the newspaper. This is actually, we can document this very clearly. I think there's probably two elements for this. One is with the increasing sexuality of the street, when there's so much in public view on billboards and all over, this has led to a natural reaction, a more puritanical reaction to try to remove women entirely. Of course, the big issue with this is if looking at a woman's picture, entices men and drives them to all sorts of sexual fantasies, then as we say Talmudically, kal v'chomer, all the more so, the live face would do that even more. This leads inexorably to this phenomenon that women should be covered, as you have in Israel, the Taliban women, where they walk around with their face completely covered. Of course, that hasn't happened, and the rabbis have spoken against this, because that's a brief or it wasn't something they instituted. I'm not sure, but logically, it makes no sense. If you can't look at a woman's picture in a newspaper, certainly there should be a problem looking at a woman's face. The other element is, I don't think you can remove this from the fact that women have become more important in the workforce and society at large, and I do think that that's threatening for a number of people. They're worried about this entering into the religious realm, and therefore, the removal of women isn't just in the pictures. You'll see if you read the Haredi papers now, they won't even say Mr., Miss, they won't even mention the name of the bride, they won't mention the wife's name. It's all about, in a sense, keeping the woman firmly behind her husband in a role where she's neither seen nor heard.
Wow. Okay. So, do you think there is some form of religious imperative, or even just a value, to prioritizing truth over censorship? And who do you think best articulate this view?
Okay, back to the book here by Mark Shapiro. Terrific book. The Limits of Orthodox Theology, Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised. Rabbi Shmuel Ibn Tibbon, the translator of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, and a philosopher in his own right, is another of the medieval scholars who did not accept creation ex nihilo. According to him, the four elements matter are eternal, as are the heavenly spheres. All creation, such as it was, took place in the sub-lunar world. Some years later, the outstanding philosopher and biblical commentator Gersonides maintained that the world was created from eternal formless matter. So he lived in the 14th century. He is adamant that creation of matter out of nothing is impossible, and this is the basic stumbling block for creation ex nihilo as far as he is concerned. That even God cannot do this does not limit God in Gersonides' eyes, for the inability to do the impossible implies no imperfection. While Gersonides sees creation ex nihilo as an impossibility, he is quite willing to defend the notion of matter without form, something that Aristotle rejected. Rabbi Shem Tov Falequara also accepted the notion of creation from eternal matter, which Maimonides identifies with Plato's view. So Maimonides knew the major Greek philosophers. perhaps afraid of the controversy such a view would engender, as well as worried about the effect this view would have on the religiosity of the masses, Palaquara was somewhat ambiguous in some of his discussions of creation. Okay, so he was worried about what the effect of this view would have on the religiosity of the masses. So in every time in human history, in every circumstance, there have been basic truths that you could not say out loud without negative repercussions. That is the way the world works. So how do you then act? You learn to keep your mouth shut in certain circumstances, or you become prepared to pay the price for saying heretical things out loud, or you use irony or sarcasm, or you just squirt out a lot of squid ink so that people can't really tell what exactly you believe. So these are all tips for surviving YouTube's new terms of service. A complete reading of the relevant text clearly demonstrates that Faliquar rejected creation ex nihilo. Indeed, not only does he say that Plato's opinion corresponds to the view of the Torah, he even states that Plato received this information from the Jewish sages. 2 centuries before Faliquara, Rabbi Solomon ibn Gabirol of the 11th century was also not entirely clear regarding this matter, and some scholars understand him to be denying creation ex nihilo. Should also note the view of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who died in year 1140, that the patriarch Abraham believed in the eternity of matter when he wrote Sphira Yetzirah, a work popularly attributed to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, or to the patriarch Abraham. Only later, after receiving God's revelation, did Abraham abandon this view. Yet, according to Yehuda Halevi, there is no fundamental religious objection to Abraham's original belief. In Yehuda Halevi's words, if a believer in the Torah finds himself obliged to acknowledge and admit pre-existent matter and the existence of many worlds prior to this one, this would not impair his belief that this world was created at some particular time. Yeah, that's what we need. Squid ink nationalism. The only way to survive on social media these days. There's also the position advocated by Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, 13th century Rabbi Hasdai Crescus, and Rabbi Yosef ibn Kaspi, 1280 to 1340, that God continually and from eternity creates the world, eternal creation, or to use Avera's words, God converts the world eternally from non-being into being. What creation means, according to these thinkers, is eternal ontological dependence of all existence upon the Creator, or if you will, the continuous information of matter by the form of the world. In support of this contention, Abulafia and Crescus cite the words of a prayer from the morning service. He creates each day continuously the work of creation. Ibn Kasbi writes, every use of the expression creation is true. How many creations are there in the world every day? This combination of creation and eternity of the world, while reconcilable with the biblical account, conflicts with the notion of temporal creation after non-existence, which is what Maimonides requires in his fourth principle of the Jewish faith, fourth principle out of 13.
You know, I think one of the novelties perhaps of the book was that I showed, contrary to what many people assumed, that there actually a great deal of support can be brought from earlier sources to support altering of the past for the needs of the present. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean censorship. That means presenting a false version of the past. But really, it doesn't seem like it's too far away. Although I would say that the sources in the other direction are much more. I wasn't trying to prove the point, make the argument. That's why I didn't really argue this. It's obvious. There's numerous texts that speak about the value of truth. And the very notion that I could tell a text that doesn't belong to me, and I could alter it. You know, I could do that to my own work, but the idea that I could alter someone else's text that violates all sorts of restrictions on intellectual property. And Rabbeinu Tam famously put a chayrim on people who would alter the text of the Talmud, and would apply to other texts as well because they thought they knew better. Now, he was referring to people who thought that there was a mistake in the text, but all the more so if you think that you know better than the person who wrote it. After all, the Talmud tells us that the seal of God is truth. It tells us, it speaks.
Okay, that's Mark Shapiro there in conversation with Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz, the president and dean of Valley Beit Midrash, on the topic of Orthodox rabbis censoring the truth. So that's valleybeitmidrash.org. Before taking leave of this fourth principle, one more point must be noted. One need not be an esotericist to see that there are serious problems with Maimonides' claim that no one who doubts creation ex nihilo is a heretic with no share in the world to come, without delving too much into the often discussed problem whether Maimonides had a secret view of creation. It is clear from Maimonides' exoteric teaching. So esoteric and exoteric, two very different words. So esoteric means unclear, exoteric means clear. Teaching in the guide that even he did not regard creation ex nihilo as a fundamental religious doctrine. Also significant in this regard is the passage in the Mishneh Torah, Hilchot Teshuvah 3:7, where Maimonides lists those who qualify as heretics. There is no mention here of creation ex nihilo. Instead, he refers to one who denies that God alone is the first cause and rock of the universe. Another place in which one might have expected some mention of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, is at the very beginning of the Mishneh Torah, but what Maimonides actually says there is somewhat different. It is striking how he seems to go out of his way to avoid any mention of creation. Maimonides wrote, "The foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all the sciences is to know that there exists a first existent God, that he gives existence to all that exists, and that all existent beings from the heaven to the earth and what is between them exist only due to the true reality of God's presence." So according to this passage, God is the cause or source of all that exists, but this does not mean that he created these existence out of nothing. Rather, gives evidence, can be understood as meaning that God is the eternal cause or source. In fact, nowhere in the Mishneh Torah does Maimonides mention creation ex nihilo, point which raised eyebrows and created controversy in medieval times. And who can forget that controversy?
It's negatively about liars, censorship, and covering up what the great rabbis of the past said and twisting what they said, I think has to be put into this category. And if I could just give the way that it was put, I think very beautifully by Rabbi Nathan Kamenetsky in the introduction to volume, which he wanted to write the story of his father, but also of the great rabbis of the past. He said that the ultimate disrespect to the rabbis of the past is by censoring and distorting who they were. Why is that? Because he says, a certain great rabbi who maybe had a temper problem or something. He still was a great man, but he wasn't perfect. And Kamenetsky wants to discuss that aspect. Those people who will rewrite the history and make it seem as if he never had a temper or that he opposed Zionism, what they're basically saying is that they don't respect these rabbis. Because if they respected him, they respect him even though he was a Zionist. But they can only respect the ones who they create, their own, the ones that they fashion. So what is the greatest disrespect? It's saying that these rabbis, we don't really respect them who they are. We only will keep them in our canon if we present a false portrait of them. And as he concludes, that is the greatest disrespect and a violation of the tradition of how we have to live with
Wow. So is there any case where you would think that censorship would be a value? Meaning we know there's a tension in the Masorah between Shalom and Emet. Is there any case where you would say, actually, there I can see why they did this and this made sense? Or do you think there's a sort of a really a pinnacle value of truth here that should always be honored?
Well, I think, truth, I do believe, as Maimonides said, that there could be different truths for different people. And first of all, not everyone is able to understand every aspect. Rav Kook writes that even if you know something is true, if you think it'll negatively affect he's referring to someone's faith, you should not share it with them. That is, not everyone needs to be.
Wow, I better stop sharing this because it might negatively affect some of your faith statements. I would not want to do that. In the Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides discusses at length the Platonic view, which maintained that the world was created by God fashioning eternal matter. He refers to a passage which seemingly advocates this position in the Masorah. Wherefore were the heavens created from the light of his garment? He took some of it, stretched it like a cloth, and thus they were extending continually, as it is said, who coverest thyself with light as with a garment, who stretchest out the heavens like a curtain. Wherefrom was the earth created? From the snow under the throne of God's glory. He took some of it and threw it, as it is said, for he said to the snow, Be thou earth. Since Maimonides believed this passage to have been written by the important Tana, Rabbi Eliezer. Tana means a rabbi who lived prior to year 200 of the Common Era. Its apparent acceptance of the Platonic position must have been regarded by him as highly significant, so between 200 before the Common Era to 200 after. But although Maimonides, as well as Duran and Albo, discusses the implication of this passage, neither he nor they entirely discount the possibility that there is another way of understanding it. Rabbi Ezra ben Solomon, however, states without hesitation that this text is in accord with Plato's opinion that it is impossible for the creator to create something from nothing. Yet, before one concludes the disposition is no different from that of Gersonides, must be noted that as a Kabbalist, he does not believe that the eternal matter existed in the temporal world. While the matter indeed existed, it was hidden in the divine mind, only brought into the temporal world through a process of emanation. Certainly the Kabbalistic existence that Rabbi Ezra speaks of hardly corresponds to anything the philosophers had in mind. And I'll go back here to Mark Shapiro talking to Rabbi Dr. Shmuley Yanklowitz.
Be exposed to all the truths. We all know, as you mentioned, that there are certain values even more important than truth, not hurting people's feelings. Of course, that opens the Pandora's box because the censors assume that they want to hide the fact that Rabbi X was a Zionist because it hurt people's faith, because then they can become a Zionist.
So should we start hiding truths so that we don't hurt anyone's feelings, right? Should we hide truths about, say, racial differences so we avoid hurting anyone's feelings?
It's very tricky to know where to draw the line. And it's even considered from a scholarly perspective acceptable that certain truths don't need to be revealed today. I mean, it's standard practice to keep files sealed for 50 years until the people are no longer alive. So my book raised more questions, I think, than answers. I think we can all agree that at certain times, not all truths need to be known. For example, and when you write a biography, as I've done, you uncover all sorts of material. Does that mean that, what's the difference between a biography and voyeurism? Does that mean that every element needs to be included? So the author needs to figure out what is considered essential and what's not. And it is tricky, and there will be times when there'll be debates between people and you can come down on different sides. However, once an author already publishes his text, and then you reprint it and choose for reasons of your own, it shows that the author, we say the balabas, you control the author. That certainly is a different level of prevarication and audacity, than we've been speaking about.
Great. Okay, my last question for you. You mentioned that you're writing, or it says in your bio here that you're writing on Rav Kook right now. Can you share a little bit about what approach you're taking?
Yes, I mean, people might be wondering, what about Rav Kook? There's been so many books about Rav Kook. You can have college courses, you could study him for a long time and, hardly begin to cover everything that's been written about him. However, we've been very fortunate that in the last 15 to 20 years, including just this year and last year, new writings of his have appeared. For the first time, we see the Shmona Kvatzim, his notebooks in which the standard texts that we know are wrote, etc., were written, and we could see the sorts of editing, even censorship in that text. And numerous new works have appeared in recent years, and this is really causing us to reevaluate texts that we never saw earlier. We can understand, for example, Tzvi Yehuda, his son, was not very comfortable with Rav Kook's Hasidic side. He wanted a much more of a Litvische type of Rosh Hashiva, so that was taken out. We see elements, for example, where Rav Kook valorizes the masses. Let me mention just one passage to show you how subversive and explosive this sort of stuff could be, which explains why he was censored. Rav Kook writes about how when it comes to pure morality, that is found among the masses, the simple, pious Jewish masses, not among the rabbis who, because of their great Talmudic learning, can twist things in all sorts of different directions. He says the masses need the rabbis to tell them what the Jewish law is, but the rabbis need the masses because they have the sense of what true Jewish morality is. So he privileges the masses over the rabbis for what he calls a Musar TV, a natural morality that comes from living a Jewish life. I mean, this is a sort of a very provocative and almost subversive sort of comment. It really brought out our picture of who Rav Kook was.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, Rabbi Dr. Mark Shapiro. Make sure to pick up his wonderful books. It changed.
Okay, that's a little interview there with Mark Shapiro. Let's get back to this dangerous, subversive book, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised. As for Maimonides' view of the Platonic position, he notes that there are many passages in the Torah and other writings that could be interpreted to support it. In contrast to the Aristotelian view that the world is eternal, according to Maimonides, would destroy the Torah, he claims there is no religious reason to reject the Platonic view. Thus, he would have no difficulty accepting this view and interpreting scripture in accordance with it if reason so dictated. Marvin Fox has summarized Maimonides' opinion as follows: it seems evident that even though he does not consider the Platonic view to be the preferred or the exclusively correct view, Maimonides does admit it, alongside the theory of creation out of nothing, as a legitimate and acceptable opinion on both philosophical and religious grounds, can be shown to accord with one acceptable reading of scripture and with the teachings of numerous canonical midrashim. Midrashim are rabbinic scriptural stories. From this evidence, we seemingly must conclude that Maimonides accepts the Platonic position as consistent with prophetic teaching, though it does not follow that he considers it to be the best interpretation of that teaching. If someone finds it persuasive, there is no reason to object, since it does not contradict any principle of the Torah or of philosophy. So Fox is not describing any hidden view of Maimonides. This acceptance of the Platonic position should not be viewed as an esoteric position. It is perfectly open and direct. Rabbi Gedalia ben Solomon Lipschitz, 17th century, suggests the reason Maimonides did not include creation ex nihilo in the principle so precisely because he did not regard it as an essential belief even for the masses to whom Lipschitz believed the principles were addressed. Having thus seen that Maimonides himself was fully prepared to deny creation ex nihilo, there is simply no way one can take seriously his contention that someone who even doubts this principle is a heretic. As to his reasons for saying something he does not really believe, I will return to this in my discussion of the 8th principle of the Jewish faith. That's Mark Shapiro there, and let's listen to a little more here.
Rabbi Dr. Mark Shapiro, who received his doctorate from Harvard University, one of the last to receive from Professor Twersky, received his rabbinical ordination from Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt, and has written many books, which I've enjoyed, and I'm sure you have as well, Between the Yeshiva World and Modern Orthodoxy, about the Sridei Eish, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, which has really shook the Jewish studies world to rethink our principles of faith, and most recently, Changing the Immutable, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History, which is our discussion today. I'm privileged to have been a direct student of Rabbi Dr. Mark Shapiro at YCT Rabbinical School, where I took a wonderful course or two from him. And it's really a delight to be with you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Changing the Immutable, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History. Why did you write this?
Well, one of my great interests is, well, first of all, the study of Orthodoxy, but also the history of Jewish books, bibliography, and over the years, I noticed some very interesting things that often you find books that said something in the first edition, and in later editions, they weren't saying anything. So on the one hand, that's interesting from a bibliography.
So with Mark Shapiro, you're listening to a guy with an IQ north of 160. All right, this man is brilliant.
Graphical standpoint. But I began to pay attention to the fact that the reasons these changes were taking place was for a variety, for ideological reasons, for religious reasons, and many years ago I started collecting all these sources that are early examples of censorship, of changing between one edition and another. And then I concluded that I could tell a story of Jewish intellectual history by focusing on how books have been altered, particularly in the Orthodox world, but not exclusively.
How has it been received so far?
Well, I think it's been received very well. Good reviews, it's selling a lot, I'm asked to speak a lot. I think in the Jewish world, in the Orthodox world, let me say, there's great awareness among many people of these updatings of history, so-called truths of the past, maybe so pleasant for certain people, so others take it upon themselves to update it or change the past. And many people are troubled by that, and that created, I think, a good deal of interest about the book even before it appeared.
What's your personal view on this balance between truth and censorship?
I believe that the truth needs to be told, that it's not our job is to be censoring. Certainly, not our jobs to be censoring the writings of great rabbis. That's what I find most interesting and disturbing. Figures that we look up to, great rabbinic figures that There are people who feel it's okay for them, as it were, to know more than the great rabbis, alter what they write, just cut it out. On the other hand, I also recognize that history, the way I see it and the way it's done in the academy, is not how it's been done in societies. In traditional societies, there is no notion of study of history for its own sake. History has a purpose. The past is really more about the present than the past itself. And therefore, I understand what motivates people to take liberties with texts and history. But from my standpoint, it's something.
Can you share 3 or 4 interesting examples where Jewish history was revised, in perhaps some?
Okay, back to this book, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised. This book does not devote much attention to the esoteric reading of Maimonides with regard to this principle. It must be mentioned that not only does Ibn Tibbon deny creation ex nihilo, but he can also be read as implying that Maimonides' secret teaching denies it as well. This must be taken seriously for the reason that Maimonides himself said that Ibn Tibbon completely understood the secrets of the Guide to the Perplexed. Other rabbis also thought that Maimonides' secret teaching was not in accord with his exoteric affirmations of creation ex nihilo. So exoteric means explicit, plain. Esoteric means difficult to understand, elusive. Among modern scholars who have argued this point, mention should be made of Herbert Davidson, who adduces evidence that Maimonides held the Platonic view, and Abraham Nuriel and Warren Zev Harvey, who believed that Maimonides accepted the Aristotelian position. So press 1 in the chat if you believe that Maimonides accepted the Platonic view, and press 2 if you believe that Maimonides accepted the Aristotelian position. There are even those who have argued that not just the Guide, but also the Mishneh Torah teaches the eternity of the world. This is in contradiction to Maimonides' exoteric view that his method of demonstrating the existence of God in the Mishneh Torah based on eternity does not represent his true view. Harvey makes the following striking statement: an examination of Maimonides' statements in his great code, the Mishneh Torah, reveals that the Aristotelian premise of eternity is indeed required for the fulfillment of the divine commandments to know God and to know that he is one, that Abraham our father had in fact come to know God on the basis of the Aristotelian premise of eternity. We just whipped through principle number 4 of the 13 central principles of the Jewish faith, according to Moses Maimonides, the Rambam.
Examples that you share in your book that hadn't previously been explored as much?
Yeah, well, let's take, for example, one, the Maimonides Guide for the Perplexed. Important work, the most important Jewish philosophical work. It appeared first in the 16th century and it appeared a number of other times with standard commentaries. If you look in the commentary called the Ephodi, which is like the Rashi on Perplexed, in all the editions of it, you get to the edition published in the 1870s, the Warsaw edition, which is the edition that everyone knows, everyone has today. It's the only edition you can get with the commentaries, which is why no one knew this example I'm going to mention. But in all the prior editions, there's a comment by Ephodi explaining that Maimonides really believed that the story of the finding of Isaac happened. And this is how we interpreted Maimonides. By the time you get to the 19th century, this is no longer acceptable. Didn't even know it was acceptable during the 16th century, the 17th century, etc. And therefore, it was deleted, it was removed. And not only does that take an important position in Jewish religious history out of discussion, it prevents people from dealing with matters, science and Torah, which has recently been of great interest. They were not aware of this important concept by Ephodi. It's not important to me at the moment whether Ephodi is correct in his interpretation of Maimonides, but here's an example of where it's just something was just removed. We have examples in Halacha as well, where texts that today maybe would seem the position of early authority doesn't work, as it were, today. So, for example, the great Rav Moses Sofer writes about the time of ending of the Sabbath. It's earlier than we are accustomed today to end it. Therefore, you're stuck with a problem, because if people see what the Chatam Sofer wrote versus what people do today, there'll be a disconnect. So the easiest thing to do, and this was done, was simply delete his comments.
Okay, let's move on to principle number 5 of the Jewish faith. According to Maimonides, only God is to be worshipped. Fifth principle teaches only God is to be worshipped. Stars, spheres, angels, and elements and their compounds have no free will, and as such must not be used as intermediaries to reach God. Maimonides puts it, our thoughts should be directed towards God. May He be exalted, and we should leave everything else aside. Apart from employing philosophical reasons to support this principle, Maimonides would have been able to point to a passage in the Jerusalem Talmud, Baruch 9:1. The man who has a friend is faced with a time of distress. He does not enter his friend's house suddenly, but goes and stands beside the courtyard door of his protector, calls upon his friend's servant or a member of his family who reports to him a certain person is standing outside. Holy One, blessed be He, is not so. Instead, God has said, the time of distress comes upon you. Appeal neither to Michael nor to Gabriel to answer me. Appeal to me, and I will immediately answer you. There is no dispute among later authorities about the first part of this principle, namely that only God is to be worshipped, but there is a great deal of debate on Maimonides' comment about intermediaries. After all, the Hasidic Jews relate to God through the Rebbe, through their Rebbe. The Talmud discusses how angels bring man's prayers to God, concluding that therefore one should not pray in Aramaic, as the angels do not understand this language. Talmud simply refers to prayers directed towards God, which are then brought before him by the angels. While there is no indication from this source that the person engaged in prayer has the angels in mind, this is only a short step from actually asking the angels to intercede on one's behalf. It is thus not surprising that such intercession is indeed found in Talmudic literature. For example, in Tractate Brachot 60b records a prayer directed towards the angels upon entering the privy. Sanhedrin 44b states, Rabbi Yochanan said one should ever implore mercy that all heavenly beings may support his effort in prayer, so that he may have no enemies on high. According to Rashi and Rabbi Shmuel Strashun, 1794 to 1872, this text refers to requests for angelic assistance. Midrash Tanhuma portrays Moses asking the earth, stars, mountains, valleys, sea, and the angel Metatron to intercede with God on his behalf. So press 1 in the chat if you pray to God directly with no intermediaries. Press 2 if you ever invoke intermediaries on the road to the one true God. Press 3 if you are an atheist. And press 4 for more of this discussion between Rabbi Mark Shapiro and Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz.
Was the wiser, and that worked well for until it was figured out what was done. One final example I can give you: an art scroll is often culprit in these areas. The Rashbam, Shmuel ben Meir, very important medieval sage, halachic authority, commentary on the Talmud and on the Bible. Mm-hmm. He has a commentary. Whole Torah, including the first chapter of Genesis. We're missing a number of chapters, but in that commentary he states that according to the Pshat, the simple explanation of Genesis, the day does not begin in the evening, where a custom of thing. It actually begins in the morning. And this is his understanding of it. Doesn't mean that he changes Jewish law. The Shabbos still starts in the evening, but we know that many times that the simple Pshat, simple meaning of the Psukim is not exactly what the rabbis say. This was so troubling that our scroll simply deleted it. The crowd could hold that appeared this year.
Would you say this desire or acceptability for revisionism of the last, let's say, 15, 20, 30 years is more common or less common than it was throughout Orthodox history?
Oh, it's much more common because today we have a new phenomenon of mass printings of books. Print is cheap today. So books are printed, and books are often printed by redoing the type, because you can do that on a laptop. And that means it's very easy simply to delete passages that are problematic. And examples abound. I just wrote about a new example in a recent blog post, which came about just 2015, so I put it in the book. There's a famous passage, Orthodox feminists like this passage very much, in which Rabbi Yosef Messas, who's an important North African rabbi, writes about how he refers to a book that records how in Spain there were communities where women would have women's prayer services, and women would wear taliot, and some women would even wear tefillin.
This is found in his book of Drashot. This was reprinted in 2015. Whole drashah, the whole sermon is there, except for that section dealing with women putting on tefillin and regular wheat. And the reason they could do that so easily is simply because it was set anew.
Wow.
Just leave it out. Approbations, or a book, for instance, when you reprint books and you do the typeset, it could simply take out his approbation. Although we have plenty of examples where.
Okay, moving on, chapter 5 of this superb book by Mark Shapiro. It is possible that similar requests for angelic intercession led the anti-Christian polemicist Celsus, 2nd century, to believe that contemporary Jews actually prayed to angels, although it is also possible that some Jews did direct certain prayers to angels. Press 3 in the chat if you direct certain prayers to angels. So there's the prayer Shalom Aleichem, which may be understood as directed to angels, and Jews say that prayer on Friday nights before eating Friday night meal. In later years, we find that one of the Geonim, either Sharira or Hai, in 10th or 11th century, defended the practice of requesting favors from angels either directly or through amulets. Well-known Jewish magical texts and amulets often invoke angels. Among Rishonim, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yehuda of Worms lived 1165 to 1230, a leader of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the pious Ashkenazi Jews, and Rabbi Zedekiah ben Avraham Anav, 13th century, defend the practice of asking angels to intercede with God, citing rabbinic sources to buttress this opinion. Prayer attributed to Rabbi Yaakov ben Meir, the Rabbeinu Tam, lived 1100 to 1171, begins, I entreat you, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael, you stand in prayer before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. Rabbi Samson Morpugo, 1681 to 1740, also defends this practice, arguing that since all power lies with God, there can be no harm in asking the angels for assistance. The numerous other sages who agree with this view include Rabbi Israel Brunner, 1400 to 1480, Rabbi Gedalia Lipschutz, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, 1697 to 1776, Rabbi Judah Azad, 1794 to 1866, and Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Thus comes as no surprise that a number of commonly recited slichot, penitentiary prayers, contain requests for angelic assistance. For example, the slicha Maknisei Rachamim, which appears in the prayer book of Rabbi Amram Gaon, 821 to 875, includes the plea, angels of mercy, usher in our petition for mercy before the Lord of mercy, intercede for us, and multiply prayer and entreaty before the King, the Most High God, mention before him, let him hear of the observance of the Torah and of the good deeds performed by those who repose in the dust. Similar requests for angelic intercession recited during the sounding of the shofar is found in the Chabad Machzor. The best known request for angelic assistance is recited by many Jews on a weekly basis. It is found in the 3rd paragraph of the Friday night hymn Shalom Aleichem, which reads, bless me for peace, O angels of peace, angels of the exalted one. Also noteworthy is the phrase in the grace after meals, which reads, on high may merit be pleaded upon them and upon us. So I believe that I'm trying to think of the great rabbi of the 20th century, leading holocaust in the United States, Rabbi Moses. He would not say certain verses of Shalom Aleichem because he understood them as appealing for intercession on the part of angels, which he regarded as heretical.
It's just a photo offset, and they just leave a blank space.
Mm-hmm. So my last question for you today is, what do you think the Orthodox leadership's policy should be today? Phrased another way, if someone came to you and they said, look, your scholarship is very interesting, but we're just too afraid. We're too afraid that if the masses understand this position or that, we're going to lose them from Torah, or if they come to understand something that isn't the norm today, they'll be confused, or they're gonna swerve from our authority or from our positions today. How would you lessen the fear of that camp?
And that's exactly what they say, and it's a paternalistic argument.
Right.
I would only say that in the era we live in today, that approach is always going to be counterproductive. Knowledge is out. Although it's not something I do, I understand that in the ghetto years ago, this might be in a policy
doctors used to not give complete information about diagnoses if they thought it was a fatal diagnosis. I mean, the Patient's Bill of Rights is a relatively recent thing. But in today's day and age, it's completely counterproductive. And the fact that the book is popular and people are interested in learning about it simply shows that our community is intelligent enough that we can be honest with it and explain what people in the past did, what they thought, and why maybe we do or we don't follow what they did in the past without covering it up and creating an illusion of a past that never existed.
There it is, the importance of knowledge, the importance of openness and transparency, and of spreading scholarship, even if it makes some people uncomfortable. Thank you so much. You can follow Rabbi Dr. Mark Shapiro's writings on the Sfarim blog, where he writes quite a bit. It's also a wonderful.
Okay, great. So let's get back to this terrific book by Mark Shapiro, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised. Following, prayer is directed toward the angel Zavadia and appears in many contemporary Hasidic and Sephardic prayer books. Zavadia, preserve me and keep me alive, so shall it be thy will, living God and King of the universe, who has all living things in his hand. The prayer, which first appears in Rabbi Raphael Emanuel Harishi's Mishnat Hasidim, Amsterdam, 1727, is supposed to be recited 3 times after Hallel, the prayer from the Psalms, on Rosh Chodesh, meaning the beginning of the month, as a special prayer for long life. Recognizing the problematic nature of this request, some prayer books instruct the reader only to have the prayer in mind rather than actually verbalizing it. Other modern prayer books substitute God for Zavadia, thus solving the theological problem of addressing prayers to angels. This emendation also makes the prayer correspond to Psalm 41:3, the Lord preserve him and keep him alive. So in folk Judaism, as opposed to Judaism coming from the rabbis, you'll find people saying, oh, you should say this particular prayer. It has power, it, changes the way the universe works. So if you really want to make some progress with your life, you need to say this particular prayer. Though he personally opposed all prayers directed towards angels as a violation of Maimonides' 5th principle, Rabbi Shmuel Lieb Cowders, 1768 to 1838, recognized their history and popularity and was forced to conclude, we must not regard all of Israel as erring, God forbid, and in particular, since the great ones of the generation saw and heard this and did not protest, this means that they did not regard the practice as forbidden. In other words, acceptance of Maimonides' 5th principle was regarded by him as a matter of choice, and this is how matters stand today throughout the Orthodox world. So let's get a little bit more of Rabbi Dr. Mark Shapiro. Let's find some other discussions with him. Okay, here's an interview.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Words of Conversation here at the Bayit. We are very fortunate and honored to be able to have our scholar in residence this weekend, Dr. Mark Shapiro from the University of Scranton, and certainly a well-known author, widely read by so many different groups within the Jewish community. And he writes on a tremendous variety of different topics. And so that's the basis for some of the questions that I'm going to be asking you now, Dr. Shapiro, during our conversation. First of all, thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
We're delighted that you're able to make it. I wanted to ask you, you're famous, or perhaps some would say notorious in certain circles, for your writings on 2 important areas of Jewish thought. One is the area of what is a Torah biography, and to what degree should it be a hagiography, which is sort of a glowing idealistic depiction of a Gadol B'Yisrael, versus factual biography of a Gadol B'Yisrael. And you've written about it, and your work on this Bal Sridei Eish, Rav Weinberg, was really groundbreaking and transformative for so many people who read the book, including myself. And so that's one area, and you've done other work on other very interesting and also controversial figures like Saul Lieberman.
So Rabbi Daniel Korobkin has great meaning to me. It's when I was going through my conversion to Orthodox Judaism, I was called before a panel of 3 rabbis at Beit Din, and I was kind of put through the ringer, and seemed like I was not going over too well. I was not exactly lying down for the rabbis and just repeating the things that you're supposed to say when you're trying to convert to Judaism. I was saying I found this challenging and this distasteful and this and that, and I was kind of pushing back and I was challenging. And at the end of this, Rabbi Korobkin, he was the one who came up and he gave me a smile and he shook my hand, and wow, it meant so much to me at that kind of difficult time in my life. So thank you, Rabbi Korobkin, for being such a mensch. You have powerful and wonderful influence on all sorts of Orthodox Jews who are still intellectually alive and questioning and don't just necessarily bow down before the rabbis. So thank you to Rabbi Korobkin, who's now in Toronto. Although Maimonides includes as part of the principle the notion that angels do not have free will, there are numerous sources that disagree with this. For example, we've got from the Babylonian Talmud, the tractate Yoma 77a reports that God punished the angel Gabriel for not fulfilling his command properly. That one can have a philosophical bent and still not share Maimonides' view on this matter is apparent from the fact that both Rabbi Sadia Gaon and Rabbi Shmuel ben Hophni, died at 1013, believe that angels have free will. Press 1 in the chat if you believe angels have free will. Press 2 if you believe they do not. Rabbi Meir ben Simeon of Narbonne, best known for his vitriolic attack on the doctrine of the Sphirot, that means divine emanations. It's popular in Kabbalistic Judaism, mystical Judaism, also asserted that angels have free will. Of course, the very notion of requesting angelic assistance would make no sense unless the angels possess this freedom. Many important authorities, including Rabbi Sharira Gaon or Rabbi Hai Gaon, Rabbi David Kimhi, Rabbi Bachya ben Asher, died 1340, and Rabbi Chaim ben Attar, 1696 to 1743, even claim that angels have the authority to alter their divine mission. Press 3 if you believe angels have the authority to alter their divine mission. Their proof comes from the story of Lot, Genesis 19. After the angels tell Lot they are going to destroy the entire plain of Sodom and Gomorrah, as God has commanded them, Lot asks them to spare one of the critics cities so that he can flee to it. One of the angels replies, "See, I have accepted thee concerning this thing also, that I will not overthrow the city of which thou hast spoken." This angel was a very formal speaker. Another relevant passage not noted by these scholars is Genesis 32:27, where Jacob demands and receives the angel's blessing. This too shows that angels have free will and that they can make on-the-spot decisions independently of God. Rabbi Bachya further points out there is an explicit biblical text that supports the notion that angels can use their free will in opposition to God's plan. Job chapter 4 verse 18 reads, "Behold, he put no trust in his servants, and even his angels he charges them with folly." As if there were not enough, Rabbi Bachya even speaks of angels who sin. Press 4 in the chat if you believe that angels can sin, as does Rabbi Hezekiah ben Abraham, 14th, 15th centuries, and Rabbi Yonatan Eberschutz, 1690 to 1764. In support of this notion, Rabbi Eberschutz calls attention to the famous high holiday Piyut Unataka Toka, the prayer, traditionally attributed to Rabbi Amnon of Mainz, 10th century, which reads, "Behold, it is the day of judgment, to muster the heavenly host for judgment." Eberschutz remarks, if there is punishment, there must be sin. Press 5 if you believe if there is punishment, there must be sin. Though he believes that angels have free will, Eberschutz also agrees with some rabbinic sources that assert that angels do not have an evil inclination. Press 6 if you believe angels do not have an evil inclination. Now then he asks, could they come to sin? He responds that their sins are not acts of rebellion, but rather the product of good intentions. Equally uncomfortable with the idea that angels can deliberately disobey God, Rabbi Moses Chaim Luzzatto claims that there are times when an angel is not given full knowledge of his mission and has to exercise his own free will, which sometimes leads to error. Press 7 if you believe that angels are sometimes not given full knowledge of their mission. Although it undoubtedly makes many moderns uneasy, the idea that angels can challenge and even rebel against God, as well as the notion of fallen angels, can find support in a number of rabbinic and Zoharic texts, as well as in Philo, who is a Jew who lived about 2,000 years ago in Egypt. For example, Bereshit Rabbah 59 states, because the ministering angels revealed God's secrets, they were banished from their precincts for 138 years. Rabbi Hama ben Hanina said, the angels were punished because they expressed themselves boastfully. First part of this midrash is cryptic since it is not clear what secrets the angels revealed. There is no confusion about the last part, which is alluded to by Rashi. It refers to the idea that the angels overreached themselves by taking personal responsibility for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, saying, "For we will destroy this place." In Devarim Rabbah 11:10, we read how two angels, Uzzah and Azazel, came down from near the divine presence and coveted the daughters of the earth, and they corrupted their way upon the earth until thou didst suspend them between heaven and earth. Confronted with the evidence, even as modern scholars, Rabbi David Zvi Hoffman, 1843 to 1921, is forced to conclude that the belief in fallen angels is part of the rabbinic tradition, accepting it even though he acknowledges that it is difficult to understand. Although Maimonides considers these beliefs heretical and would either reject or more probably interpret any objectionable rabbinic passages allegorically. That's what you do when you got a very difficult text and you need to deal with it. You just interpret it allegorically. Press 7 in the chat if you're into interpreting difficult texts allegorically. Sources quoted illustrate that such views are part and parcel of the Jewish tradition and that Maimonides' fifth principle has not been accepted. As for Maimonides' opinion, it has been suggested correctly that his views on this matter were influenced by Greek philosophy, and the Greeks were a bunch of goyim. And we do not say that one is required to follow after and believe that which Maimonides said as a philosopher, because that which he said as a philosopher came from the Greeks, and the Greeks were goyim, and what do they know? Rabbi Yosef Messus, 1892 to 1974, goes so far as to suggest that Maimonides did not truly deny the validity of prayers containing requests for angelic intercession. Rather, his opinion was only stated as a protective measure, was directed toward the masses of his time to prevent them from thinking that angels could act independently of God for good or bad. But in our generation, when there is no one who believes this, Messus concludes that even Maimonides would permit such prayers. Leaving aside the obvious error of Messus's assertion, his comment is interesting for two reasons. First, it is a good illustration of a common phenomenon which post-Maimonidean scholars attempt to bring Maimonides' views, in particular his philosophical views, into line with popular practice and conceptions. Since Maimonides is such a central figure, many regard this tactic as preferable to saying that Maimonides' views should be rejected. For those who are not satisfied with explaining problematic passages in Maimonides' philosophical works on an ad hoc basis, there arose as early as medieval times the view that towards the end of his life Maimonides became a Kabbalist. Okay, press 8 in the chat if you believe that Maimonides became a Kabbalist. Kabbalist means a mystic. Those who accepted this legend were no longer troubled by Maimonides' now irrelevant philosophical musings. Maybe I'll become a Kabbalist so that you will no longer be troubled by my irrelevant philosophical views. Second point of interest in Messus's comment is his claim that Maimonides did not actually accept everything he stated in the principles. Wow, did the Rambam not believe everything he said was an essential principle of the Jewish faith? This notion that there are necessary beliefs in the principles is something I will return to in greater detail in my discussion of the eighth principle. Another opponent of Maimonides, although in a less extreme way, is Rabbi Nissim Garandi, 14th century, puts forth the strange and original position that there is one particular angel before whom prostration is permitted. Okay, which angel is prostration permitted? Rabbi Nissim makes this claim in the course of explaining how it was that Joshua prostrated himself before an angel, Joshua chapter 5 verse 14, an act which should be forbidden just as it is forbidden to sacrifice an animal, burn incense, or pour a libation to an angel. Prostration, sacrifice, incense burning, and libation are the four forms of worship singled out by the Talmud as always forbidden, even if this is not how the deity in question is usually worshipped.
And so forth. And the other area, which is another area for which you're very famous, is your work on the Rambam's Ikrim. And the whole area of the both tracing the historical milieu and perhaps the influences that caused the Rambam to compose the Ikrim, your discussion in your very also.
So the Ikrim referred to the 13 essential principles of the Jewish faith, according to Maimonides.
Groundbreaking book on the fundamentals or dogma within Judaism, the Rishonim, who dissented from the Rambam, and the issue of dogma in Judaism.
Okay, the Rishonim were great rabbis who lived, I believe, from the 11th to the 14th century. Those were the Rishonim. The Achronim came from the 13th to the 15th, 16th century.
Judaism in general. So I want to just sort of briefly address those two areas. If you could please reflect on the two issues. Number one, what do you feel drew you to these two focal areas of academic study?
Well, let's start with the first one. I've always been interested in the history of great Torah sages, Gedol Yisrael, and when I went to graduate school, already from the beginning, I knew that I wanted to write a dissertation on Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, because already in my yeshiva years, I had become interested in him. I was fortunate that the more I researched his life, the more interesting it became, and even subsequent to writing the book, I keep coming with new information, and it's a fascinating story. So I wrote the biography, I wrote the dissertation, and it became the biography. I published some of his letters. I never intended the book to become as popular as it became. I never thought it would. I thought it would be interesting to maybe scholars of Orthodoxy, Jewish history, and enlightened rabbis. I had no idea that it would, it really turned him into a household name, and wide spectrums of the Orthodox community, including very right-wing figures, Dayanim, Rosh Yeshiva, Poskim, who also found it quite interesting. And although that was never my intention, and I think...
Okay, Dayanim are great rabbis who sit on a Beit Din. They lead a Beit Din. That's what a Dayan is, and a Posek is someone who makes rulings on Jewish law. So back to this book by Mark Shapiro. Rabbi Nisim does not suggest that prostration to an angel performed as an act of honor is permitted just as it is with humans. It's probably because the Talmud specifically exempts prostration to humans from the prohibition if it is not done as an act of worship. The implication is that prostration is by definition to be regarded as a form of worship with regard to angels. According to Rabbi Nisim, however, there is one angel who is special in this regard and before whom one can prostrate oneself. This is the angel spoken of in Exodus chapter 23, verses 20 to 22, concerning whom God says, "My name is in him." It is because this angel in some way shares an aspect of God's divinity that this angel is treated differently from other angels. How is this angel different from all other angels? Because he has the divine presence in him. As Rabbi Nisim puts it, prostrating before him is as if one is prostrating before God. Rabbi Menachem Rekanati, 13th to 14th century, and Rabbi Yosef ben Solomon Alashkar, 16th century, offer an alternative approach, suggesting that one is permitted to prostrate oneself before an angel if it assumes human form, just as one is permitted to do this in front of a real human. Rabbi Isaiah of Treni, the older, okay? So do you guys hold that one is permitted to prostrate before an angel if it assumes human form? Press 9 in the chat. And Albo proposed a different reason, claiming one may prostrate oneself before an angel, but only in recognition of its role as a messenger of God. Before concluding this discussion of the fifth principle, it must be noted that, despite the clarity of Maimonides' formulation, difficulties are presented by his other writings. Indeed, it appears that Maimonides later changed his view from that expressed in this principle, for in his Guide to the Perplexed, he writes, "The spheres and the intellects apprehend their acts, choose freely, and govern, but in a way that is not like our free choice and our governance, which deal wholly with things that are produced anew. All this indicates that they apprehend their acts and have will and free choice with regard to the governance committed to them, just as we have will with regard to that which from the foundation of our existence has been committed to us and given over to our power." This passage directly contradicts Maimonides' statement in the fifth principle, as well as in his letter to Abadia the proselyte, the convert, that the angels, meaning intellects, and spheres have no free will. One of the biblical proof texts cited by Maimonides in the Guide is already familiar to us. Genesis chapter 19, verse 21, in which the angel, in response to Lot's request that he spare one of the cities of the plain, replies, "See, I have accepted thee concerning this thing also, that I will not overthrow the city of which thou hast spoken." To be sure, the free will of which Maimonides is speaking is different from human choice, for humans sometimes do things that are more defective than other things, and our governance and our action are preceded by privations, whereas the intellects and the spheres are not like that, but always do that which is good and only that which is good with them. Thus, the angels and spheres have free will that they exercise consciously, yet they always choose the same thing, the good. This means that while there is a theoretical difference between what Maimonides writes in the Principles and what he writes in the Guide to the Perplexed, there is no real practical difference with regard to angelic actions. For our purposes, however, the difference is quite significant. For in the Principles, Maimonides requires one to affirm a theological notion that is contradicted by his work, The Guide to the Perplexed.
I think that most people, I mean, this is a very unusual person, a person who struggled with things. Professor Mordechai Breuer commented to me that not since Rabbi Yaakov Emden was there a Gadol Yisrael it was so complicated. So I had to portray this, and I think I successfully was able to show the struggles. I think most people came away with a sense of admiration and appreciation. Some people might have had a different perspective, might have seen that maybe he didn't do right by his wife, things like that. But I think most people realize that this is a person pushed in a position that he really didn't have any control over. And it's a sad story all around. So I'm happy that people receive this inspiration, but when I sat down to write it, I was writing it as an academic work, and in hagiography, you leave out the things that are not comfortable for you. I wasn't writing, quote, orthodox history, by which I mean that with orthodox...
Okay, not such great technical quality there at koshertube.com. What I don't understand is, why isn't KosherTube more popular, more successful, and more remunerative than YouTube? Right? KosherTube is the real Jewish streaming service. Maimonides also contradicts the fifth principle in the Mishnah Torah, where he records a Talmudic saying, whenever one enters the privy, before entering, he says, "Be honored, holy, honorable one, servants of the Most High, guard me, wait for me until I enter and come out, as this is the way of humans." Press 10 in the chat if you say this prayer before you enter the privy. This prayer is directed to the angels, which are said to accompany every man. Their protection is needed at this point, since the privy was regarded as a place inhabited by demons. Not be proper for the angels to accompany one inside. Press 11 if you believe the privy is inhabited by demons. Leaving aside the problems created by the fact that Maimonides does not acknowledge the existence of demons, press 12 if you believe in demons. That in Guide to the Perplexed, he interprets the idea of two angels accompanying every man to refer to the good and evil inclinations, the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov. This halakha stands in direct contradiction to his admonition in the fifth principle not to turn to the angels, as our thoughts should be directed towards him, may be exalted, and we should leave aside everything else. Finally, there is one more place where Maimonides contradicts the fifth principle. In his essay on martyrdom, he speaks of God punishing the ministering angels after they have criticized the Jewish people. Angels do not act on their own, as Maimonides states in this principle. They obviously cannot be punished, even according to the Guide to the Perplexed, which states that angels have free will. They never exercise this will wrongly. This contradiction can probably be explained by noting that Maimonides' essay on martyrdom, not a philosophically sophisticated treatise, rather it is a popular work designed to get a point across, and as Chaim Soloveitchik has argued, should be regarded as a work of rhetoric. They put it, the essay on martyrdom aimed not at truth, but at suasion, at moving people by all means at hand towards a given course of action, even without positing the existence of an esoteric Maimonides. It is axiomatic in Maimonidean scholarship that the opinions expressed in such popular works do not necessarily represent Maimonides' true view, and we have just rocketed through principles 4 and 5 of the Jewish faith according to Maimonides. And let's go back to Mark Shapiro talking with Rabbi Daniel Karofsky.
You know what the result is, and you just are trying to get there. my job was to write the history and offer my interpretations as best I could. And if it turned out, for example, that at the end of his life, he, in his deathbed, he rejected everything he stood for and became a Satmar Chassid, I would have had to report that as well, because I'm trying to report the truth and the history of it. And I do think that with figures, great figures, they don't suffer from that, because greatness is such that it should be able to withstand critical scrutiny. And if it can't, then maybe you have to ask yourself, are we really dealing with great people? But great people also have conflicts and turmoil. Rabbi Weinberg, in one of his early essays, his essay actually on Achad Ha'am, writes that, and you could say this about himself as well, great people don't see it as a compliment if you say they have no contradictions and
Precisely.
turmoils.
Yeah. But sometimes the greater the person, the greater the conflict. Chazal even echo that. They say, Kol hagadol mechaver yitzro gadol mimenu. So that certainly is well rooted.
Yeah, the greater the person, guys, the greater the conflict. Baruch Hashem. Bye-bye.